Hello, my name is Thea Yegerlener, and I am an energy analyst in the City of Ann Arbor's Office of Sustainability and Innovations. I'll be walking through Ann Arbor's 2021 community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. Greenhouse gas inventories take many forms for many purposes. This community-wide greenhouse gas inventory estimates major sources of emissions associated with Ann Arbor, like using electricity and natural gas, burning fossil fuels in our cars, and disposing materials. It's estimated on an annual basis. Some of the sources of data I use are not available at the level of granularity of Ann Arbor and are based on scaled or modeled data. For more information on the data sources, methodology, and assumptions made in the preparation of this inventory, please visit a20.org. This is not an exhaustive list of every source of emissions associated with our community. For an estimate on household carbon footprints that take into account emissions associated with things like goods and services, take a look at the Cool Climate Calculator linked on this slide. I'll focus today on digging through recent changes we've seen in emissions levels. I'm going to start by sharing the general change in Ann Arbor's community-wide emissions since 2000, a year we have a baseline established. This chart shows the overall trends in climate pollution or greenhouse gas emissions and sources that we have comparable data for in 2000 and 2015 through 2019, or pre-pandemic levels. In 2000, greenhouse gas emissions were roughly 2.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which factors in the global warming impact of multiple greenhouse gases. That is equivalent to 40 million tree seedlings grown over 10 years. In 2019, we have seen a 25% reduction in these emission sources from 2000. This chart illustrates what sectors have seen significantly lower emissions levels since 2000. Commercial and institutional, or University of Michigan, emissions are combined here as buildings have changed hands. Over 80% of these changes are seen in emissions associated with the energy used in our buildings. While we actually consume more energy in our buildings, these emissions have fallen as the electricity from the grid becomes cleaner. In addition, the average vehicle on the road is more fuel efficient than those in 2000. With that context in mind, I'd like to take a look at the last 2 years of emissions. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted our lives in many ways, from stay-at-home orders, financial hardship, workforce shifts, and families disrupted and lives lost. We also saw empty streets and shifts in where we spent our time. 2020 emissions were 37% lower than 2000 levels, and 2020 emissions were 31% lower than 2000 levels. I want to dig into where we saw these changes in emissions levels occur. I'm going to switch to talking about an inventory that includes more emission sources than those included in the 2000 baseline inventory. I call this the expanded inventory. The largest impact of these are those associated with commuting patterns into and out of Ann Arbor. This is the same trend I showed earlier, but including more emission sources than we have data for 2000, so that comparison isn't available. So these emissions levels are slightly higher than those shown on the previous slides I shared. 67%, or 2/3 of emissions, come from our community's residential, commercial, and institutional buildings. An additional 3% come from upstream emissions associated with the use of electricity and natural gas in those buildings. Transportation represents 28% of community-wide emissions, and our disposal of solid waste and treatment of wastewater represents the remaining 2% of community-wide emissions. This chart shows what sources our community's emissions come from. Our buildings use electricity and combust fossil fuels. We burn fossil fuels in our vehicles, and waste decomposes into methane. Overall, we see a trend of emissions from electricity and vehicle fuel dropping recently. Here is a breakout of emission sources for the year 2021. You can see electricity is the largest source, followed by natural gas and vehicle fuel that are at equal amounts. From 2019 to 2021, emissions dropped 11% overall. Again, we largely see these emissions changes happening in our buildings and in transportation. Residential buildings emissions dropped 8%, commercial and institutional 10%, and transportation dropped 18%. I'll start by taking a look at emissions levels in our buildings. Residential buildings, including multifamily buildings, represent 22% of community-wide emissions. Slightly more emissions are associated with electricity use than natural gas, with a small amount attributed to propane. These are the emissions for commercial and industrial buildings, which represent 16% of the community's emissions. This sector is the least certain for calendar year 2021, as DTE has not yet been able to share community-wide aggregate consumption data for this sector. The estimate for 2021 is based on the trend of previous year's consumption and a comparison to the University of Michigan's electricity consumption, as these two usually track fairly closely. There was a large dip in consumption in our commercial buildings around town in 2020 as office buildings and commercial spaces were unoccupied. Unlike residential buildings, commercial building emissions are primarily attributed to electricity, and commercial electricity consumption is highly correlated to how hot it is outside. 2020 was not a relatively cool year, and 2021 was even hotter, so this may be underrepresenting emission levels. The University of Michigan's use of electricity and natural gas represents 29% of community-wide emissions, compared to 37% for the rest of our community's buildings. Electricity and natural gas consumption is publicly available through the University of Michigan's environmental metrics. Emissions from electricity consumption are driven by two factors: how much of it we consume and what was used to generate the electricity. From 2019 to 2020, we saw an overall drop in electricity consumption and a shift in what sectors it was consumed in, as residential consumption increased. DTE's fuel mix also shifted away from coal for that year, and you can see in the previous slides the trend line of the fuel mix track with the overall emissions associated with each building sector's electricity consumption. In 2021, the fuel mix was much more similar to that of 2019 and earlier, and carbon intensity of electricity increased as well. Things like offsets and voluntary green power purchases aren't included in official greenhouse gas inventories, as these purchases do not directly impact emissions associated with a community. However, it is helpful for informational purposes to see that Ann Arbor's residential participation in My Green Power makes up about 10% of electricity consumption, which was estimated from the overall number of enrolled customers. Complete data is not available for the commercial class to show at this time. These changes in building emissions make up roughly half of the reduction from 2019 to 2021. Changes in transportation make up the other 50% reduction in emissions levels. You can see passenger vehicles and commuting make up the majority of Ann Arbor's transportation emissions. These changes in emissions are due to changes in how much we use our vehicles. Google's Environmental Insights Explorer estimates annual historic vehicles miles traveled for the purpose of greenhouse gas inventories. We see a large dip in VMTs in 2020, over 30%, and a rise back up to 2021, though not quite level to 2019 levels. 2020 was an anomalous year with a large drop in greenhouse gas emissions. I reviewed these emissions, acknowledging that some of the drivers of reductions would likely not be seen in the future, like lower VMT levels overall. Commuting is a significant source of emissions for Ann Arbor, and continuing to allow employees to work from home is one powerful tool to reduce them. I want to return to the action Ann Arbor needs to meet HG0 goals. We've seen an overall drop in emissions levels since 2000, primarily due to a cleaner grid. I want to emphasize, however, that simply greening the grid will not achieve HG0. This green line shows the actions still needed if we switch today to 100% renewable energy. We would still need to electrify our buildings and vehicles and implement widespread energy efficiency improvements to help make those changes more affordable. I also only touched on data on emissions today, but HG0 also addresses important improvements to our community, like centering actions on equity, increasing resilience, and strengthening our social cohesion that isn't measured in greenhouse gas emissions. For more information on the A20 plan and the greenhouse gas inventory, visit a20.org. You can see the inventory is navigable from the landing page. For specific questions on the inventory, feel free to send me an email at tjagerlunner@a2gov.org. Thank you for watching.